Warning, this video discusses historical violence and disturbing events from the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Some content may be unsettling and not appropriate for younger viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Hey everybody, welcome back to Behind the Veil, where we're discussing the tragic events of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. For anyone who wants any of the source material for this video, you can check out the link in the description and it'll take you to our website where you can find that. So what happens when faith, power, and paranoia collide? The Mountain Meadows Massacre remains one of the darkest stains in LDS church history. In fact, according to Sally Denton, the Mountain Meadows Massacre was the largest and most brutal killing of immigrants in the American West, unparalleled in its scope and savagery. What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version of events taught in Sunday school or depicted in carefully curated memorials. This is raw, unflinching truth of how religious zealotry, paranoia, and unchecked power led to an atrocity that still sends chills down my spine. We'll uncover disturbing details of how Parley P. Pratt, who was an LDS apostle, manipulated and lured a married woman to become his 12th wife, convincing her it was her only path to salvation, only for him to meet a violent end at the hands of her furious husband. And his death didn't just leave blood on the ground in Arkansas. It unleashed a wave of rage and retribution in Utah, where LDS members were told that all Arkansas men were accountable for Pratt's murder. We'll recount the story of two little girls, desperate for water, gunned down during the siege of the Baker-Fancher Party at Mountain Meadows. And then we'll take you into the massacre itself. Immigrants lured out under false promises of safe passage, disarmed, and then brutally executed. Men shot point blank. Women clubbed to death as they begged for their lives. Victims' throats cut as their cries echoed through the valley. But the horror didn't end with the killing. The dead were stripped of their clothing, their bodies left to rot in shallow graves, while their belongings, all their clothing, jewelry, and even their cattle were brazenly looted and sold at auction to the very people who orchestrated their deaths. And the survivors? Only 17 children, all under the age of 7, were spared. And it wasn't out of mercy. It was because they were too young to remember what they had seen, so they could not testify against the perpetrators of this atrocity. This is the story that the LDS Church has fought for decades to bury under layers of half-truths and deflection, but today we're bringing it to the light. So stay with us as we uncover the shocking events leading up to the massacre. It's the twisted ideologies that justified it, and the haunting legacy it left behind. And this isn't just history. It's a cautionary tale that echoes into the present day. So you're not going to want to miss a single detail.
The Mountain Meadows Massacre, which occurred September 11th, 1857, stands as one of the darkest and most controversial chapters in the history of the American West. A wagon train of approximately 140 immigrants from Arkansas, which is important, as we just detailed that is where Parley P. Pratt was killed. They were known as the Baker-Fancher Party. They were brutally ambushed and slaughtered by a group of Mormon militiamen in southern Utah with the assistance of Paiute Native Americans. Now, I want to highlight here, the Native Americans that were involved in this were manipulated and kind of lied to by the Mormon militiamen to participate, even though the church tried to blame the Native Americans for this atrocity, when in reality, it was the militiamen, Mormon militiamen, that did this and tricked the Native Americans into participating. This massacre exposed the violent extremes to which theocratic control and isolationist paranoia could push a religious community. The incident remains an enduring stain on the legacy of the LDS Church, raising questions about the role of church leaders, particularly Brigham Young, and what part he may have had in sanctioning or indirectly facilitating the brutal attack. The murder of, as we spoke before, LDS Apostle Parley P. Pratt earlier that year was falsely attributed to the immigrants by members of the church, which further inflamed anti-outsider sentiment among LDS church members. We will tell the story of Parley P. Pratt's murder by a jealous husband a little later in the podcast, so you don't want to miss this sordid tale. In the massacre's immediate aftermath, LDS leaders sought to obscure the truth, blaming the violence on local Native Americans, a claim that historians have long debunked as completely false. Evidence overwhelmingly points to the Iron County militia, led by high-ranking Mormon officials such as John D. Lee, Isaac C. Haight, and William H. Dane, as the architects of the slaughter. Although John D. Lee and one of Brigham Young's wives, Anne Eliza Webb, both claimed the order for the massacre came from, quote, higher leadership, indicating that it was not merely a local order. The LDS Church's handling of the massacre in the years since has further fueled criticism. For decades, the church maintained that the incident was an act of Native American aggression, a narrative that has, like I said, been fully disproven by both forensic evidence and survivor testimony. Even after acknowledging the Mormon involvement, the church has resisted calls for full transparency, sparking accusations of historical whitewashing and institutional complicity. The Mountain Meadows Massacre is a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked religious extremism and the lengths to which power structures, such as the LDS Church, will go to preserve their narrative and to preserve their reputation. It is not just a historical event, but a cautionary tale that continues to resonate in discussions about accountability, church leadership, and the intersection of faith and violence. So let's do a short introduction of the Baker-Fancher Party. Who were they? Where were they coming from? Where were they going? Before we move on to all the events leading up to the massacre. The Baker-Fancher Party was a caravan of immigrants traveling from Arkansas to California in the spring of 1857. The party was comprised of around 140 men, women, and children. The group was considered one of the wealthiest and best equipped wagon trains of its time, bringing livestock, supplies, and substantial wealth with them. The immigrants were primarily farmers and ranchers seeking better opportunities in California, a common aspiration during the westward expansion of the United States.
It's important to understand that Utah operated as a de facto theocracy. Brigham Young's control extended over the militia, judiciary, and legislature, creating an environment of religious and political isolation and church control. All of these details were leading to a boiling point between Utah Mormons, outsiders, and the U.S. government. President James Buchanan, viewing Young's defiance of federal authority as a rebellion, sent 2,500 federal troops to the Utah Territory in what became known as the Utah War. This conflict heightened Mormon fears of persecution. Brigham Young declared martial law in Utah, warning settlers against aiding outsiders and urging them to prepare for war. These developments created a climate of paranoia and hostility towards non-Mormons, particularly those traveling through Mormon settlements. So let's look at some of Brigham Young's fiery rhetoric against outsiders during the time leading up to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and we'll let you decide what you think about his involvement in this horrific violence. First, we have a sermon from July 26, 1857, where Brigham Young declared, "If any miserable scoundrels come here, cut their throats." I think this statement is pretty self-explanatory. Brigham Young constantly spoke about graphic violence against apostates and any individual who were not members of the church. And we'll see later on in this investigation of the Mountain Meadows Massacre that, just like Brigham Young was saying here, a lot of these victims' throats were cut. And this fact alone kind of brings Brigham to the forefront and be like, did he really have something to do behind this? But we'll continue on with several other quotes and we'll let you guys decide. Brigham Young gave a directive against trading with outsiders in August of 1857, which was right before the Baker-Fancher Party arrived. Young said, "I forbid any man to sell a kernel of grain or pound of flour or meat to any of those passing through here, or to feed them on their way to the land of gold. Historian Sally Denton explains, Young's edicts against outsiders were not only strategic, but also ideological, reinforcing the narrative that saints were God's chosen people surrounded by enemies. Brigham Young's violent and hateful proclamations in sermons caused paranoia along with disdain for outsiders among these early saints, which fueled a lot of violence. Judge John Cradlebaugh spoke of the lawlessness and violence that permeated early Mormon culture under the reign of Brigham Young in his testimony before the United States House of Representatives, which we've covered in multiple previous videos.
I find it so interesting that apologists try to use the excuse that everyone else was doing it, so it was okay that we do it too. I mean, if you're claiming to be God's one true church, God's chosen people, you're better than the Gentiles, why are you acting like them? Yeah, it was the Wild West, but that doesn't mean that you should be acting and behaving in the same way. So apologists are claiming violence and crime was the norm in the Wild West. And like I said, it fails to address the fact that LDS people claim they are the chosen people of God. They are God's one true church. And yet, in the same breath, they will claim that acting in the exact same manner as the culture around them was perfectly acceptable, even when that culture was violent, full of crime, and hateful. All things that are completely against the teachings of Jesus Christ, whom they claim to follow. You simply cannot have it both ways. Either you are the righteous chosen people of God who act differently than the culture around you, or you are no better than any other people or religion you are surrounded by. So moving on. Now we're going to detail the murder of Parley P. Pratt and how it played a role in this Mountain Meadows Massacre. And I find this interesting that I do have a kind of personal connection to this story because I have a family member who named their daughter Parley after Parley P. Pratt, and they don't actually realize why Parley was killed, and I just find it quite ironic that they named their daughter this name. But moving on. So the murder of Parley P. Pratt in May 1857 was a pivotal event leading up to the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Parley P. Pratt was an apostle of the LDS Church, and he was killed by Hector McLean, a distraught and enraged husband who sought justice after Pratt lured his wife, Eleanor McLean, into a polygamous marriage. Now realize, Eleanor was never divorced from Hector. Parley convinced this woman that her marriage was not valid in the eyes of God because it was not a sealed marriage by the proper authority. But in the eyes of the government or anyone else, the marriage to Parley was entirely illegal, as it would have been considered polyandry. This woman was already married. To put the exploitive nature of the marriage in perspective, Eleanor left her husband to become Parley's 12th wife under the guise that it was the only way that she could obtain salvation in the kingdom of God. And they used a lot of "you'll be damned" and all this stuff rhetoric to really manipulate people into engaging in such an exploitive situation as polygamy. Eleanor encountered Parley P. Pratt during his missionary travels in California. Eleanor became enthralled by Pratt's teachings, particularly, this is what it is, the promise of eternal salvation through polygamous marriage. They were saying the only way that you could have eternal salvation is if you are married polygamous marriage, not monogamous marriages. This was a central tenet of Mormon theology during this time, was that it was required for your salvation. Pratt convinced Eleanor that her marriage to Hector was spiritually invalid and that by becoming his plural wife, she could secure herself a place in the celestial kingdom. And I want to point out here emphatically that this is spiritual abuse. Men in the early Mormon church used the abusive rhetoric that women could only obtain salvation through polygamous marriage to coerce scores of women to marry them. She was taught that she could not obtain entrance into heaven with her current husband because he was not Mormon. Eleanor's decision to follow Pratt had devastating consequences for her family. She abandoned her husband, a betrayal that Hector perceived as both a personal and moral affront because they were never divorced. And therefore, her relationship with Pratt was adultery, plain and simple. In a desperate attempt to reclaim his family, Hector pursued legal recourse. That was his first, that was the first place that he went. He was seeking to enforce his parental rights over his children and also hold Pratt accountable for what he viewed as the abduction of his wife and children. Despite his efforts, the legal system proved ineffective in curbing Pratt's actions, as Mormon communities often shielded their leaders from external interference.
Mm-hmm. And when Hector McLean learned of Pratt's release from jail and caught up with Pratt on the Zeeley property in Fine Springs, Arkansas, some 12 miles northwest of Van Buren, he shot and stabbed Pratt to death. Parley P. Pratt was murdered by a jealous husband for seducing his wife. And this is certainly not the behavior of a moral religious leader. McLean later defended his actions as those of a husband protecting his family from a manipulative religious leader who had destroyed his marriage and had abducted his children. This tragic event illuminates the exploitative and deceitful practices that underpinned Mormon polygamy and highlights the consequences of Pratt's actions in fueling anti-Mormon sentiment and paranoia in the Utah Territory. Pratt's murder sent shockwaves through the Mormon community. LDS leaders, including Brigham Young, portrayed Pratt as a martyr who had been killed for his religious beliefs. They framed McLean's actions as an extension of the broader persecution faced by the Saints, using this incident to galvanize their followers against some perceived external threat. This narrative ignored Pratt's roles in instigating this conflict through his deceitful and exploitative behavior, casting him instead as a victim of anti-Mormon violence. And it's important to understand that Pratt's murder occurred in Arkansas, and this is where the Baker-Fancher Party departed from. And Pratt's murder became a rallying point for Mormon leaders, and they used it to justify their growing hostility towards outsiders. News of Pratt's death reached Utah just months before the arrival of the Baker-Fancher Party, and rumors falsely linked these immigrants to McLean and the murder. These baseless accusations further inflamed tensions between the immigrants and the local Mormon settlers, contributing to the hostility that culminated in the massacre. Moreover, Pratt's actions and subsequent death highlighted the dangerous intersection of religious zealotry and personal ambition within the LDS leadership. His manipulation of Eleanor McLean and defiance of legal authority exemplified the exploitative nature of Mormon polygamy, which we have extensively covered in some past videos. I highly recommend you go check out all of our videos done on polygamy. And this exploitative system, combined with the church's rhetoric of persecution, created a volatile environment in which violence against outsiders was both rationalized and ultimately enacted. As tensions escalated between Mormon settlers in the Utah Territory and the federal government, Brigham Young declared martial law on August 5th, 1857, an act that would play a critical role in the events leading up to the Mountain Meadows Massacre. President James Buchanan's decision to send federal troops was known as the Utah Expedition, and this was to replace Brigham Young as governor, and this was perceived by LDS leadership as a direct threat to their autonomy and survival.
Brigham Young's proclamation forbade non-Mormons from passing through the territory without explicit permission and directed local militia forces to prepare for defensive actions. This decree created an atmosphere of heightened suspicion and fear, exacerbating hostility towards immigrant parties traveling through Utah. Young's rhetoric and actions during this period framed outsiders as existential threats to the Mormon community. His martial law declaration, he actually stated, quote, "We are invaded by a hostile force who are evidently assailing us to accomplish our overthrow and destruction. This is very powerful rhetoric, causing a lot of fear among the members of those that might be coming from outside into Utah. By presenting the federal government and non-Mormon immigrants as aggressors, Brigham Young fostered a siege mentality among his followers. The directive to withhold supplies and assistance from immigrants further marginalized groups like the Baker-Fancher Party, leaving them vulnerable and isolated. Now, they actually did refuse to give supplies to the Baker-Fancher Party, which was leaving them very vulnerable as they were traveling through Utah. This militarized environment, combined with Young's fiery sermons, primed local Mormon leaders and settlers for violent actions against perceived enemies, culminating in the massacre at Mountain Meadows. Mormon militia forces organized under the Nauvoo Legion began fortifying key positions and preparing for guerrilla warfare. These preparations were accompanied by all of his fiery sermons, which he has had fiery sermons from the beginning. These invoked themes of divine protection and vengeance, further inflaming the tensions between the saints and outsiders. The rhetoric of persecution and divine justification for violence, that was one of the biggest issues, is that they were invoking the name of God, saying this is like righteous vengeance on outsiders. And this was all propagated by Brigham Young and other LDS leaders, laying the groundwork for these tragic events that would unfold in September of 1857. The Los Angeles Star reported the pervasive belief that, quote, the blow fell on these immigrants from Arkansas in retribution for the death of Parley Pratt. The Southern Vineyard later charged that no sane man who knew the Indians would believe that they had perpetrated this act of barbarity. It was beyond the power of credulity to believe natives had acted as the Mormons claimed, since the, quote, extermination of so large a number of men without the escape of a solitary individual is unheard of in Indian warfare. And I just want to be clear, the use of the word Indian is the way that they stated this in the paper. The reports of the incident in newspapers throughout the United States at that time speak of the fact that Native Americans would have taken the women captive rather than killing them in the brutal manner that was done. The cover story of the LDS Church was not fooling anyone in the outside world. U.S. citizens knew that this brutal attack did not fit the narrative that had been spun by LDS leaders. The Baker-Fancher Party, led by Alexander Fancher and John T. Baker, the group included individuals experienced in overland travel. They followed the well-worn southern route, passing through Kansas and the Nebraska territory before reaching the Mormon-controlled Utah territory. Their route took them through Salt Lake City and southern Utah before they intended to cross into Nevada and then eventually to California. The immigrants' wealth and independence made them conspicuous in a region dominated by Mormon settlers who did not have a lot of money. They had been instructed by Brigham Young to avoid dealings with outsiders. The Fancher Party was denied supplies and subjected to unfounded accusations by Mormon settlers, including claims that they had poisoned wells and livestock, which was not true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. These accusations, which they have been discredited by historians, were likely fueled by local suspicions and resentment towards the immigrants' visible prosperity. The party also became entangled in the broader atmosphere of paranoia, as baseless rumors linked them to the murder of LDS apostle Parley P. Pratt in Arkansas earlier that year, even though they had absolutely nothing to do with it. Despite these connections, the Fancher Party pressed on, reaching Mountain Meadows in early September 1857. There, they camped in a lush valley, unaware that their presence had become the focal point of escalating animosity among local Mormon leaders and settlers. What began as a hopeful journey towards a prosperous future ended in tragedy as the group became victims of a deadly combination of wealth, mistrust, and volatile political climate in the Utah Territory. Local leaders in southern Utah, particularly those in Cedar City, played a central role in the escalating tensions with immigrants. Isaac Z. Haight, the mayor of Cedar City and stake president in the LDS Church, was instrumental in organizing the response to the Fancher Party. Hay, along with other leaders such as John D. Lee and William H. Dame, viewed the immigrants as both political and a spiritual threat. Hay reportedly advocated for violence against the party.
I find it interesting, though, these people were almost out of Utah. They were in a West desert. There were no more settlements in Utah before they reached Nevada. How could they possibly have been a threat in any way, shape, or form? They were just leaving. That makes absolutely no sense. Sorry, I just had to comment that, because obviously they were just, getting themselves all up in a frenzy for absolutely no reason.
Absolutely. And at this point, it almost seems like just solely revenge killing for Parley P. Pratt's murder. And everything else just, excuses. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And at Mountain Meadows, the Fancher Party remains largely unaware of the deadly plans being formulated against them. The combination of local animosity, unfounded rumors, and the involvement of influential Mormon leaders ensured that their journey would not end in California, but it would end right there in tragedy. So let's look at the Mountain Meadows Massacre from the perspective of John D. Lee, who was a central figure in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and he provides a first-hand account of the event in his book, Mormonism Unveiled. A first-hand account of the event in this book, or I'm rereading the same line, or the Life and Confessions of John D. Lee, published in 1877 after his execution for his role in the massacre. Lee's account offers insights into the planning and execution of the attack, as well as his attempts to shift blame onto others, including Paiute Native Americans and higher-ranking Mormon leaders. While Lee's narrative is self-serving and can be contradictory at times, it remains a critical source for understanding the massacre through the eyes of one of its key participants. And I know we said it can be contradictory at times. That's why later on in this episode, we're going to corroborate from other accounts to bring the truth out of what actually happened. And in Mormonism Unveiled, Lee portrays himself as a reluctant participant in the events at Mountain Meadows, and he claimed he acted under the orders of his superiors in Mormon leadership.
Yeah, I read a lot of the book, and I found it interesting how often Lee paints himself as being innocent. And he does, in other parts, make statements that he had been told by, or heard by Brigham Young in sermons and all of that, that when you blood atone someone, for example, or he acts out in violence at the orders of Brigham Young or any other church leader, that he is absolved of any responsibility. He is innocent, because they are literally claiming that he is acting under the authority of God. And he does claim this quite a bit. So he finds himself to be completely innocent. He claims on page 209 of his book to, quote, disobey his orders was certain death. That's Brigham Young, is who he's talking about when he says his orders. Be they right or wrong, no saint was permitted to question them. Their duty was obedience or death. Now, Lee's statements expose the broader context of blood atonement. Members of the church who defied the orders of church leaders would be considered in an open state of apostasy, which was a crime worthy of blood atonement or death. And if you want more information and context on blood atonement, because we are not going to go over that here, watch our previous episode on that topic so you can understand that this was in fact something that was absolutely carried out. And that is why people were so afraid of leaving the church or disobeying the orders of leadership. So according to John D. Lee, the immigrant train had become a source of contention among the Mormon leaders, including Isaac C. Haight, the same ones that we've listed before, who claimed that they feared the group posed a threat to the community. Lee recounts that rumors about the Baker-Fancher Party included allegations of blasphemy, whatever that is, poisoning wells, and involvement in Parley P. Pratt's murder. So he is specifically stating that rumors were kind of swirling about this. The rumors were rampant and fueled by anger among the settlers. So they were pretty much just coming up with a bunch of lies to be angry at these people. I have no idea why they would do such a thing, but this is what was happening. And then John D. Lee goes on to claim that the initial plan was to allow the Paiute Native Americans to attack the immigrants, sparing the Mormon settlers from direct involvement. But the thing is, how are you going to get these people to attack these immigrants? They're going to lie about something to get the Native Americans to do this, and then the Mormons wouldn't have any connection to it. He describes a meeting where local church leaders were meeting together. We're talking about high council members, bishops, stake presidents, where the decision was made to incite the Paiutes to attack the wagon train. Some of them did not want this to happen, but some of them did. And so they basically those that did basically just decided to go ahead and do this. According to Lee, he was instructed to, quote, use his influence with the Native Americans to ensure their participation. He recounts his efforts to convince the Native Americans that the immigrants were their enemies and that they deserved to be, as he quoted, used up. John D. Lee describes the initial attack on the Baker-Fancher Party, which began on September 7th, 1857. Paiute Native Americans, along with Mormon militiamen who disguised themselves as Native Americans, ambushed the immigrants at their camp at Mountain Meadows. However, the immigrants quickly fortified their position, creating a defensive circle with their wagons being in the center of it for several days. The immigrants held off the attackers despite suffering casualties and running low on water and supplies, because the Mormons would not give them any supplies or do any trade with them at all. And so they were running really low on food and supplies. Recognizing that the immigrants were unlikely to surrender without further action, John V. Lee and other leaders devised a plan to lure them out of their defensive position under a false flag of truce. Lee recounts how he approached the immigrant camp with a white flag, offering the group safe passage if they surrendered their weapons and allowed the Mormons to assist them to safety. So he's basically saying the Mormons are going to help you. It's the Native Americans that are the danger. According to Lee, the immigrants reluctantly agreed, desperate to protect their families and survive the ordeal. Once the immigrants had disarmed and left their wagons, the massacre began. Lee's account of this moment is harrowing and marked by attempts to absolve himself of direct responsibility, even though he was involved in the killing. He described how the men were separated from the women and children and marched in different directions. At a pre-arranged signal, the Mormon militiamen turned on the immigrants, shooting the men at close range and attacking the women and children with knives, clubs, and guns. John D. Lee claims he was powerless to stop the slaughter, blaming the actions on the Native Americans and other Mormon participants. John D. Lee's narrative includes chilling details about the aftermath of the massacre. He describes the looting of the immigrants' belongings, the burial of the bodies in shallow graves, and the efforts to conceal Mormon involvement by placing the blame entirely on the Paiute Native Americans. Lee insists that he acted under orders and implies that higher-ranking leaders, he also implicates Brigham Young, bore ultimate responsibility for the events.
And throughout this account, Lee portrays himself as a scapegoat for the massacre, insisting that he followed the directives of his superiors. He repeatedly emphasized the role of Isaac Haight, William Dame, and others in planning the attack, while also implicating Brigham Young indirectly by suggesting that the massacre was consistent with the church's broader policies and rhetoric during the Utah War. So, let's move on to a more graphic and detailed account of this massacre. Again, like we said at the beginning, viewer discretion is advised, especially for this next part. And when I first read Eliza's book, Wife Number 19, I was surprised by the details that she provided about the massacre, and I wondered how she could have known such detail. I then cross-referenced her story with that of John D. Lee and other first-hand accounts, and realized she gave a very accurate and consistent account. And Eliza Webb paints a grim picture of life under Brigham Young's rule, and she was one of his wives and had many details of the inner workings of the church. She described Utah as a theocracy where dissent was ruthlessly silenced, and she recounts how church leaders used fear to control their followers, employing doctrines like blood atonement to justify the murder of apostates and perceived enemies of the faith. According to Webb, these teachings created an environment where violence was not only condoned as a divine mandate, but seen as a divine mandate. She wrote, "The blood of the saints was the cry that rang from the pulpits, and their revenge was demanded in the name of the Lord." This rhetoric, Webb argued, set the stage for atrocities like the Mountain Meadows Massacre by normalizing violence against outsiders. She details how it was common for travelers to plan to purchase supplies in Salt Lake City along their trek, and that the Baker-Fancher Company were very low on supplies and food, and they needed to restock in Salt Lake, but they were refused at every turn. And Eliza also states Brigham's law to refuse supplies to travelers was not to be broken, and the person who should venture to disregard it pronounced his own death sentence. Now and then, one or more humane or more daring than the rest came to the camp at night with a small amount of provisions, all they could bring without danger of detection. Starvation was staring them in the face while they were journeying in the midst of plenty. For it's a notorious fact that the harvests were never more plentiful in Utah than they were that year.
This is the tragedy that Brigham Young brought about, first of all, that these people were going hungry and basically causing, these people were completely innocent. And Brigham Young is telling people not to trade with them, not to allow them to restock or get supplies, and they're trying to get out of Utah because of the hostilities. They were mocked. There were other things that were going on throughout their trek through Utah that were just inexcusable. Eliza continues, whatever may have been Brigham Young's connection with the massacre itself, whether it was done at his instigation or merely with his distant approval, he was, to all intents and purposes, the murderer of these people. This is what Eliza, his wife, is saying, and should be held responsible for their lives. What right had he, the governor of the territory of Utah, bound by an oath of loyalty to protect every person within the limits of his territory, to refuse food to peaceful, law-abiding citizens of the same government, knowing as he did that here was their only opportunity to obtain it, and that certain death was their fate if compelled to cross the desert with the scanty rations which remained to them. The treatment of these people from the moment of entering Brigham Young's dominions until the final tragedy was so barbarous and attended with so many horrors that the Mormon people, contrary to their usual custom, felt obliged to offer some excuse and extenuation. But all the reasons which they give, when combined, are entirely insufficient to justify the deed. So then Anne recalls talk around town about Parley P. Pratt's murder, and she names it the death of the adulterer, which I find very fitting. And the thing about her is she didn't mince words. She was not buying into all of the manipulation and brainwashing that was going on. She was seeing things for what they really were. She calls it like it is instead of trying to justify Pratt's manipulative tactics to seduce yet another woman. Eleanor was never divorced from her first husband, as I mentioned before. And so then she goes and is, quote, sealed to Parley P. Pratt. This is adultery. You can't do that. So let's see what Anne has to say about how Pratt's death fueled the tensions and escalated the massacre of these innocent immigrants. She says, quote, the Mormons were deeply infuriated. They held every Arkansas man personally responsible for the murder of their apostle, whom they at once canonized as a saint. Oh, my land. And worshipped as a martyr, and whose name to this day is spoken with reverence by them. And the fact that these immigrants were from that state gave them, as they thought, an opportunity of revenging Pratt's death. I don't how you do revenge on innocent people makes absolutely no sense. She then makes the most honest statement of them all when she says the fact that Pratt had brought his death upon himself was not taken into consideration. And there you have it. That is exactly what happened. Anne continues to detail how the weary, hungry immigrants camped at Mountain Meadows and were attacked by Native Americans. But the immigrants were prepared, as we stated before. She's saying the same thing. If you remember, the reason we're repeating this is that John D. Lee said this in his eyewitness account, and here is Eliza Webb saying the same thing. They were attacked by Native Americans. They were prepared. They were returning fire. There were several injured of their attackers, which caused them to retreat. The immigrants built up a barricade, same thing that John D. Lee said, of dirt around their wagons in preparation for any further attack. It is important to understand that the orchestrators of this attack, that happened by the Native Americans, were the Mormon leaders in Cedar City. When the Native American men returned wounded and reported their unsuccessful attempt, the Mormon leaders became more emblazoned. As the immigrants hunkered down behind their barricade, believing their only risk was attack by some Native Americans, they stayed behind their barricade. The only problem with their position was they could not access the spring to get water. Anne details their predicament. The spring was only about 40 rods distance, and yet they dared not venture to go to it, and the water was as unattainable as though they had been miles away. Every attempt to obtain a supply was frustrated by the reports of cruel guns hidden behind the mounds of earth.
The whole rim of the basin was formed by circling hills and was a masked battery sending forth destruction every time a form was seen inside the barricade. At first, it was supposed that only the men were in danger, and a woman of the party stepped outside the corral to milk a cow. She fell pierced with bullets. At length, their thirst became intolerable. They decided to send 2 little girls to the spring of water. Surely they would be let to go unharmed. Their youth and innocence will be their safeguard. The most barbarous savage would certainly be untouched, and the hand of destruction stayed. It might have been, had it been savages with whom they were contending, but no feeling of pity for even the children could enter the hearts of these civilized white men who were engaged in the religious warfare and shot down their innocent victims in the name of the Lord. Hand in hand, the little ones advanced towards the spring. Suddenly came the crack of scores of rifles, and their tiny bodies fell, fairly riddled with bullets, in the very sight of frantic parents. It was the deeds of this which, according to John D. Lee, glorified the name of Israel's God. The doomed party, sick with deferred hope, soon saw a wagon filled with white men bearing a white flag. Their terrible tortures were over. The deliverers were none other than John D. Lee and the officers of the Mormon militia. According to Eliza, John D. Lee posed as a rescuer, telling the immigrants that he would consult with the Native Americans and see if he could rescue them. When he came back to speak with the immigrants, he told them that the Native Americans would allow them to go free, but only on one condition: if they would lay aside their weapons. And without hesitation, they complied with the conditions. They gave up their rifles, bowie knives, and all weapons. They are now unarmed and defenseless. And at this point, men were separated from women and children and were placed in the front. These immigrants trusted the white flag that was being waved before them. They trusted the integrity of their supposed rescuers. But their trust was in vain, for they could never have imagined the brutal tragedy that awaited them. Eliza details, in an instant it flashed across the helpless victims how cruelly they had been betrayed. With shrieks of the wildest agony, they fell bleeding to the earth. Young and old shared the same fate. The Indians, who were ambushed nearby, joined the Mormons in the work of slaughter, until not one of all the men was left. And what of the helpless women and children? Some of the women were too ill to walk. They were taken outside the corral and driven to the scene of the massacre, stripped of their clothing, shot, and their mutilated bodies were thrown in a pile with the rest. To the honor of many of the men be it said, the younger ones especially, they refused to join in this horrible work, and some of them made efforts to protect these helpless women from their tormentors.
So this is definitely a thick read. Anne was detailing a lot that of course, can be corroborated by John D. Lee and other eyewitnesses to this. I've also heard stories of individuals who had, distant relatives, obviously, but some of their distant relatives that were involved in this, and reading their stories, and they talked about clubbing the women to death in their journals. There was one relative of a woman I listened to who, family member had a scar on their face from being shot by a father because he wasn't participating. So there's a lot. I think we may even detail some of these stories a little bit later, but it is so heavy and unimaginable what these people did. There's no way that you can try to excuse this in any way, shape, or form, but yet the LDS Church tries to do so and push it off on vigilantes, as they say, and it absolutely was not. This involved high council members, stake presidents, bishops. It was not vigilantes. So Anne Eliza goes on in her book to say, I used to often, while living in Payson, see a man named Jim Pierce. This is the one whose face was deeply scarred by a bullet wound made by his own father, while the brave young fellow was trying to assist a poor girl who had appealed to him for succor. Another girl threw herself on her knees before Lee's son, clinging to him, begging for mercy. His heart was touched and he promised to spare her, but his father shot her while she knelt. Even the children were not spared. They shared the horrible fate of their parents. In vain they begged for mercy. The bloodthirsty brutes to whom they knelt had no feeling of pity or compassion. They laughed at their entreaties and mocked their terrified cries. Their little throats were cut. Their bodies were thrown carelessly in a heap. Only 17 of those supposed to be too young to remember any of the occurrences of this fearful day were saved. And of these 17, 2 were disposed of after reaching Salt Lake City. Realize what disposed of means. Because they were making remarks concerning the massacre, showing that intelligence beyond their years, they could not have them talking, and so they killed them. It is said, on how good authority I do not know, that Daniel H. Wells, mayor of Salt Lake City, one of the first presidency, second counselor to Brigham Young, lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, killed one of these babes with his own official hand. So Anne Eliza is saying, I don't know on how good authority this statement is, but there were a lot of rumors at the time that the second counselor to Brigham Young, he was a lieutenant in the Nauvoo Legion, killed one of these children who was saying too much. Then she goes on, as I said before, I cannot vouch for the authenticity of this rumor, but those who know the man best are the most ready to believe it. That definitely says something about the character of this person. He is certainly capable of an act like this. The whole affair lasted about a half an hour when the assassins rode away, carrying all the clothing and baggage of the immigrants, leaving the bodies to the wolves and ravens. A person who visited the field of slaughter 8 days after the massacre gave the following account of it. He said men, women, and children were strewn over the ground or were thrown into piles. Some were shot, others were stabbed, and others had their throats cut. They were entirely stripped of clothing, and their bodies were mutilated by the wolves. The spoils were carried to Cedar City and placed in the tithing office there, after the, quote, Indians had received their share. It is told by a man who was a mere boy that that night the spoils were brought into town. He had 2 companions slept in the tithing office. The cellars were filled with everything that had been taken from the immigrants. The bloody garments stripped from the dead bodies were thrown down on the floor. One of the men connected with the massacre came in and threw himself down to sleep without perceiving the boys. The property of the immigrants was sold at public auction in Cedar City by Bishop John M. Higby, and they were readily bought by the eager saints. To this day, jewelry is worn in Salt Lake City, and teams are seen in the streets that are known to have belonged to the fatal immigrant train.
Mm-hmm. And she continues on saying, a lady in Salt Lake City was one day showing a silk dress and some jewelry to some friends, in the presence of one of the children who had been saved from the massacre. The little one, on catching sight of the dress, burst into a frantic fit of weeping, and between sobs cried out, "Oh, my dear mamma, that is her dress. She used to wear it. Where is my mamma? Why doesn't she come for me?" and Eliza told the story of the Mountain Meadows Massacre in great detail, as she was alive when it happened and was acquainted with many who were involved. Also, of the women who had taken in some of the very young children who had been spared. The details of this horrific tragedy are hard to read, but it's important to understand the absolute brutality involved in this heinous act. One of the, I hate to say it, one of the few glimmers of humanity in the aftermath of the Mountain Meadows Massacre was the survival of 17 children, spared by their attackers because they were deemed too young to bear witness to the atrocity or to pose a future threat. Following the massacre on September 11th, 1857, the surviving children were taken from the site by the members of the local Mormon community. The attackers divided the children among their families, claiming to provide care. But historian Juanita Brooks notes that this act, while sparing the children's lives, was deeply self-serving. She says, these children were not simply cared for. They were used to obscure the truth of the massacre, as their presence in Mormon homes helped perpetuate the claim that Native Americans were responsible for the killings. The children were stripped of their familial identities, incorporated into Mormon households. They witnessed firsthand the use of their parents' belongings by the very people who had taken part in the massacre. As historian William Bagley recounts, the children saw the jewelry of their mothers on the hands of Mormon women, and their fathers' clothes worn by the very men who had slaughtered them.
It's unimaginable. It's just, I have no words. The federal government's investigation into the massacre uncovered the presence of the surviving children in Mormon households. In 1859, 2 years after the massacre, federal officials under the direction of James Lynch, a U.S. Army officer and Indian agent, were dispatched to southern Utah to recover the children. The effort was met with resistance from the local Mormon community, who were reluctant to relinquish the custody of the children. Lynch reported that retrieving the children required negotiation and, in some cases, coercion, as some families were unwilling to part with them. This is the issue. These children had family. They had grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever, back in Arkansas who wanted these children, and the Mormons were not going to release them. I just don't have words for this. The children were eventually gathered at Camp Floyd, a federal military post in Utah Territory. Witnesses to the recovery described the children as malnourished and traumatized. So how well are these children being taken care of in these Mormon homes if they are malnourished and traumatized? And yet these Mormons are just hell-bent on keeping these poor children from their families, their surviving family members. So in the Mountain Meadows Massacre book on page 125, it states, they had been so thoroughly indoctrinated by their captors that some were terrified of leaving their homes where they had been placed despite the horrors they had endured. And this is Juanita Brooks. In 1859, the 17 surviving children were transported from Utah to Arkansas, a journey fraught with logistical and emotional challenges. The federal government funded the children's return, ensuring they were placed in the care of surviving relatives. The children's journey took them across several states, drawing public attention to the massacre and amplifying calls for justice. Newspapers across the country reported on the children's plight, portraying them as symbols of both the brutality of the massacre and the resilience of its victims. Upon their return to Arkansas, the children were reunited with extended family members, though many struggled to adapt to their new lives. Having been so young during the massacre, their memories of the event and their families were fragmented. Some retained haunting recollections of the violence they had witnessed. One child reportedly told a relative, quote, "They said Indians killed my father, but I saw white men wash their faces, and they weren't Indians." Well, we know that this is true because of all of the other accounts of them trying to pin it on the Native Americans. The return of the surviving children to Arkansas marked a symbolic moment in the aftermath of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but it did little to erase the trauma of the event. Their lives were forever shaped by the loss of their families and the violence they had endured. The children's accounts fragmented as they were, became critical pieces of evidence in subsequent investigations and trials, including the eventual conviction and execution of John D. Lee. The Mountain Meadows Massacre left a lasting stain on the history of the American West, and the quest for justice in its aftermath was fraught with obstacles, political maneuvering, and controversy. Of course, the LDS Church does this today. Federal authorities and the LDS Church both sought to distance themselves from the atrocity while grappling with the need to address its perpetrators. Investigations led to the eventual indictment and trial of John D. Lee, a key participant. But the broader implications of the massacre, especially the involvement of high-ranking Mormon leaders, remained obscured, likely because there was a vow of silence that was made. And if you watch our video on the Danites and the Nauvoo Legion, including the Nauvoo Legion, they had to actually make oaths, death oaths themselves, and vows of silence for the things that they did. So it would be very, very difficult to find any sort of evidence or anyone who would be willing to talk, even among the LDS members. Lee's trial and execution, while notable, left many questions unanswered and highlighted the limitations of justice in addressing such a complex and devastating event. The federal government's initial response to the massacre was slow. It was hindered by the Utah War and the tense relationship between Washington, D.C. and the LDS Church. Federal investigators faced resistance from local Mormon communities who shielded key participants and perpetuated the narrative that Native Americans were solely responsible for the killings.
Mm-hmm. And as historian Sally Denton notes, the cover-up began almost immediately with Mormon leaders blaming the Paiutes for the violence and instructing the participants to remain silent. By 1859, federal agents had gathered enough evidence to contradict the initial claims of sole Native American culpability. Testimonies from surviving children and accounts from non-Mormon settlers in the region implicated the Iron County militia, composed of Mormon men, as the primary perpetrators. Despite this evidence, no immediate action was taken against the organizers of the massacre. Juanita Brooks explains, the climate of fear and theocratic control in Utah made it nearly impossible to pursue justice without risking further conflict with the Mormon leadership. The LDS Church also conducted its own internal investigations, though these efforts were largely aimed at deflecting blame. Of course they were.
Yeah, that's what they always do.
Of course, yeah. And I don't know how much of an investigation it could have been if they're just like, it wasn't us. Nope, it wasn't.
Yeah.
But Brigham Young himself maintained that the massacre was a spontaneous act of violence instigated by the Native Americans, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. In 1870, Young excommunicated John D. Lee and other participants, a move widely seen as an attempt to distance the church from the massacre. However, critics argue that this action was more about protecting the institution, the church, than actually seeking justice.
They've done this all the time. I mean, you think about Joseph Smith was anybody that got caught practicing polygamy. If you got caught, you got X'd. And that they've done this all the time. If you get caught doing something, the church is going to excommunicate you because they're never going to allow themselves to be implicated in their crap. You know?
100%. And it was not until the 1870s, under renewed federal scrutiny, that indictments were finally issued. In 1877, a grand jury in Beaver, Utah, indicted 9 men for their roles in the massacre, including Isaac Z. Haight, William H. Dame, and John D. Lee. However, Lee was the only one ultimately arrested and brought to trial. Federal authorities, eager to assert control over the Utah territory, to make an example of the perpetrators, focused their efforts on Lee, despite evidence suggesting that higher-ranking Mormon leaders had actually authorized the massacre. The decision to pursue Lee as the primary defendant reflected the LDS Church's efforts to find a scapegoat. Lee, who had been closely involved in planning and the execution of the massacre, was a convenient scapegoat for the broader conspiracy. As Bagley notes, Lee's role as a direct participant made him an ideal target for prosecution, while his relative lack of influence within the church allowed higher-ranking leaders to avoid accountability. Lee's first trial, held in 1875, ended in a hung jury, largely due to influence of Mormon jurors who sympathized with him. Federal prosecutors, determined to secure a conviction, moved quickly to organize a second trial. This time, the prosecution presented a stronger case, relying on eyewitness testimony and Lee's own admissions. On September 20th, 1876, Lee was convicted of first-degree murder for his role in the massacre. This trial highlighted the extent to which Lee had been abandoned by the LDS Church. Once a trusted leader and adopted son of Brigham Young, Lee found himself isolated as the church sought to distance itself from the massacre. In his memoir, Lee expressed bitterness towards his former allies, writing, "I was sacrificed in obedience to the cowardly order of a church that now disowns me."
I find it interesting that he's just convicted of first-degree murder. Just one. That's fine. Like it wasn't, despite the fact that he was later executed, it was quite a minimal conviction. And he was basically the scapegoat for the church. They are absolving. Lee was a lower ranking official, and I think that's why he was the scapegoat. They're not implicating stake presidents. They're not implicating high council members or apostles or anyone else higher than him. And I think that was more of their way of distancing themselves from church responsibility for this massacre. Lee was then executed by firing squad on March 23rd, 1877, at the site of the massacre, which I would have to say that's fairly fitting. In an act of defiance, he reportedly declared, "I am a scapegoat. I die a victim of other sins." Now, I would have to disagree with this. He was a full participant. He was at all of the meetings. He was at the massacre. He participated in this massacre. He is not a victim of other people's sins. He did not in any way have to go to the massacre. He did not have to wave a white flag to these people pretending that they were making a peace offering and going to help these people get out alive. He definitely was an active participant in all of this, but he always claims himself a victim. He does it throughout his entire book. It's really quite despicable the way that he constantly blames, it's orders from leadership, so I had to do it. It's not my fault. So anyway, it is interesting that was his final statement. His execution was publicized as a measure of justice, but many observers saw it as insufficient, obviously, because there were dozens of men doing this. In fact, I think it was over 100, but I don't remember the exact number. Given the larger network of complicity that remained unpunished in this whole scenario, it was only John D. Lee was the only one that's ever punished for this. Despite his direct involvement, John D. Lee's conviction and execution did little to address the broader responsibility of Mormon leaders in the massacre. Evidence presented during the trial, including testimony from witnesses and Lee's own writings, implicated figures such as, like we always say, Isaac Haight, William Dame, and even Brigham Young. These were church leaders. They were never going to allow them to be implicated in this, no matter how much their names were all over it. However, federal authorities were wary of provoking further conflict with the LDS Church, so they chose not to pursue any additional prosecutions. As Brooks observes, the true architects of the massacre escaped justice, leaving Lee to bear the full weight of their crimes. The Mountain Meadows Massacre remains one of the most controversial and debated events in the history of the American West. Its legacy is shaped by ongoing historical debate, efforts to memorialize the victims, and lasting impact on perceptions of the LDS Church. As historians continue to grapple with questions of the responsibility of the church and its leaders, the massacre stands as a sobering reminder of the dangers of religious extremism and unchecked, basically, religious authority. As historian Will Bagley argues, Young's command over the territory was absolute, and his teachings legitimized the kind of violent retribution that was carried out at Mountain Meadows. And Juanita Brooks also notes, even if Young did not give the order, his refusal to condemn those responsible speaks volumes about the values he sought to protect. The LDS Church's handling of the massacre in years following further complicates its legacy. For decades, church leaders blamed the massacre solely on Native Americans, a narrative, like we said before, that has been widely debunked by survivor testimonies and the historical evidence. This deflection delayed efforts to seek justice and undermined the credibility of the church's later acknowledgments of Mormon involvement. Efforts to memorialize the victims of Mountain Meadows Massacre have been fraught with controversy as well. The first official monument was erected in 1859 by U.S. troops. There was no effort to memorialize these people or apologize by the LDS Church whatsoever. These U.S. troops uncovered the victims' shallow graves and constructed a cairn to mark the site. A cairn is basically just a stack of rocks. And if you realize in 1859, the troops didn't have a lot, in their possession to be able to make much of a memorial, but they tried with what they had in that area to memorialize these people who had been so brutally murdered. But I want to emphasize this. So this is why I'm taking pause here, because these U.S. troops build this rock cairn to memorialize these people. This monument was dismantled in 1861 under the orders of Brigham Young. Let that sink in. He dismantled the memorial to these brutally slaughtered people, which further fueled suspicions about his role in the massacre and the role of LDS church leaders. Sally Denton notes the destruction of the cairn symbolized the church's determination to control the narrative and bury its culpability.
And later in the 20th and 21st centuries, renewed efforts were made to properly honor the victims. In 1999, the church partnered with descendants of the victims to erect a new memorial at Mountain Meadows. While this collaboration represented progress, critics argue that the church has continued to sanitize its narrative. The plaques at the site carefully avoid assigning blame, referring vaguely to a company of immigrants and local residents and Native Americans.
That is so BS. I just have to call that out. Local residents? Yeah, they're trying to completely distance themselves still. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, that was perfect. And these omissions have sparked criticism from historians and descendants who view them as an attempt to minimize Mormon involvement. The Mountain Meadows Massacre continues to shape perceptions of the LDS Church, particularly among those critical of its history and practices. For many, the massacre exemplifies the danger of unchecked religious authority and the lengths to which the LDS Church will go to protect their reputation. As historian Juanita Brooks observed, the tragedy of Mountain Meadows lies not only in the lives lost, but the decades of evasion and obfuscation that followed. While acknowledging Mormon involvement, church leaders have worked to frame the event as an aberration rather than a reflection of institutional values. This approach has been met with skepticism by critics who argue that the massacre was a natural consequence of theocratic rule and the culture of obedience, along with threats of blood atonement fostered by Brigham Young. Will Bagley writes that the church's reluctance to fully confront its role in the massacre undermines its claims of transparency and reconciliation. The Mountain Meadows Massacre isn't just a tragic chapter in history. It's a chilling reminder of devastation and consequences of unchecked power, religious extremism, and the erasure of truth. From the murder of Parley P. Pratt to the brutal slaughter at Mountain Meadows, we've gone over a story of manipulation, betrayal, and violence that has been shrouded in secrecy for far too long. And this is not just a story of the past. It's a call to examine how history is told and who controls the narrative, and what lessons we must carry forward to ensure such atrocities are never repeated. So if you've learned something in this episode, or you challenge your perspective, or opened your eyes to a history you may not have known, we invite you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast to people who may also like to know the truth. And your support helps uncover and share the truths that others would rather remain hidden. Together we can continue to question, to learn, and to shine a light on stories that deserve to be told. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we pull back the veil on more of LDS histories and hidden truths. See you next time.